Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a place where marble columns gleamed in the sun, senators argued about everything and nothing, and life was far less glamorous than Hollywood would have you believe. Ancient Rome, the city of triumphal arches, endless wars, emperors with questionable hobbies, and streets that smelled like a mix of olive oil, smoke, and human waste. But we're not here to talk about gladiators or Julius Caesar or any of the grand political speeches that school teachers like to recite with enthusiasm. No, we're heading into the quieter, stranger corners of Roman life. Specifically, the world of prostitutes in ancient Rome. It was an occupation both ordinary and scandalous, deeply woven into the city's fabric and yet officially frowned upon, as most enjoyable things tend to be. So, settle in. Dim the lights, get cozy under the blanket, and let's wander slowly into the streets of the Eternal City, where respectable matrons walked briskly with their heads covered, slaves carried baskets of figs, and around the corner, tucked between taverns and bathhouses, was the world's oldest profession doing brisk business. Because of course it was. The Romans had a word for almost everything. For prostitutes, the most common word was meretrix, which literally meant she who earns. A tidy euphemism, really. A woman who earned her keep by providing services, though what she earned was usually not much more than a handful of coins, a place to sleep, and hopefully not too many diseases. Rome was not exactly big on sanitation, unless you count dumping buckets of water in the street and calling it a day. Meretrices were officially registered with the authorities, which is one of those typically Roman touches. They loved their paperwork almost as much as they loved conquering Gaul. If you were a woman who wanted to practice the trade legally, you had to go to a magistrate, declare yourself, and get your name written down in a registry. Imagine that as a career milestone. Now, what did this legal recognition mean in practice? It meant you had the right to exist, but not the right to dignity. Once you were registered, there was no going back. Respectable women were expected to stay far away from such a stain, so if you changed your mind later, married a baker, and decided you wanted to blend into suburban Roman life, too bad. The record followed you forever. A permanent mark, like a tattoo, only less fun. Prostitutes in Rome came in a dizzying variety. Some were slaves, sold into brothels by owners who considered it a convenient way to make a profit. Others were freed women who chose, or were forced, to make their living that way. A few were surprisingly high class, catering to senators and wealthy men in discreet apartments. Most, however, worked in conditions that were, let's just say, less than ideal. The average Roman brothel was not the candlelit, perfumed boudoir you might imagine. It was more like a series of tiny cubicles with stone beds, no windows, and a curtain for privacy if you were lucky. And yes, they used stone beds. Clients would bring their own cloak to throw down as a cushion. A rather literal take on Netflix and chill. The location of these brothels tells you something about Roman society. They clustered near the Circus Maximus, where thousands of people came to watch chariot races, and near the Forum, the heart of public life. Conveniently placed, as the Romans were nothing if not practical. You could place a bet on the blues or the greens, cheer while someone risked their neck turning the spina, then wander a few streets over for a quick diversion before heading home to your wife, who was expected to remain chaste and patient while you did whatever you wanted. It was, shall we say, a double standard, and not one that leaned in women's favor. Interestingly, the state didn't ban prostitution. Far from it. Augustus, that famously moral emperor who liked to present himself as the savior of Roman virtue, tolerated the existence of prostitutes, even while punishing adultery among respectable women with exile. A wife caught cheating could be cast out to some lonely island, but a man who spent his evenings in a brothel was just another fellow enjoying the city's amenities. Hypocrisy? Absolutely. But hypocrisy is practically the mortar holding Roman society together. So what was the daily life of a prostitute like? Not glamorous, not safe, and rarely profitable. A meretrix might see multiple clients in a day, sometimes dozens, depending on the location. Payment was usually in small coins, bronze asses, literally. Yes, the Romans paid prostitutes with asses. Imagine the jokes. They didn't keep ledgers or invoices, of course, though we do have graffiti scratched into brothel walls advertising services and prices. A sort of ancient Yelp review system, but carved with a sharp stylus instead of typed angrily at midnight. Archaeologists in Pompeii have uncovered entire brothels decorated with frescoes of erotic scenes, perhaps as a kind of visual menu, because literacy rates weren't high and pictures were easier to interpret. Speaking of Pompeii, that unfortunate city preserved one of the best glimpses into this hidden world. The Lupanar of Pompeii, the largest surviving brothel, is still standing, with its narrow rooms and stone beds intact. The frescoes above the doors show various acts, leaving very little to the imagination. Tourists shuffle through it today, whispering in embarrassment, but back then it was simply business. The Lupanar could accommodate plenty of customers, though one suspects the working conditions were as grimy and claustrophobic as they appear now. Let's just say it wasn't exactly a spa day. Prostitutes often lived at the mercy of pimps or madams. A woman might be owned outright by a lanista, the same type of person who ran gladiators, or by a tavern keeper who offered lodging and demanded a cut of her earnings. Some worked in bathhouses, offering extra services in steamy rooms filled with gossiping men. Others lingered on street corners, identifiable by their revealing clothing or by the simple fact that they stood around at night with nowhere respectable to be. The Romans, in their charming way, often called them lupi, or she-wolves, which is where the word lupanar for brothel comes from. It wasn't a compliment. Clothing laws reinforced this. Respectable Roman matrons wore the stola, a modest garment that marked their status. Prostitutes, by law, were forbidden from wearing the stola. Instead, they wore a toga, a garment usually reserved for men. This sartorial twist was a kind of public branding. It announced that these women were not respectable, not marriageable, and not to be confused with someone's sister or daughter. Imagine walking through the city in clothes designed to announce your shame to the world every single day. Subtlety was not Rome's strong suit. As for the health risks, well, it was as bad as you're imagining, and probably worse. Rome didn't have antibiotics, latex, or a consistent understanding of germs. Venereal diseases spread easily, along with the dangers of childbirth, malnutrition, and violence from clients. A prostitute had little protection under the law. If beaten or cheated, she couldn't exactly appeal to the courts. She was legally recognized, yes, but socially disposable. And yet, despite the stigma, prostitutes were everywhere. Temples, taverns, theaters, racetracks, wherever men gathered, business followed. Still, not every prostitute was downtrodden. A few became relatively wealthy, either through careful saving, lucky connections, or by becoming a favored mistress to someone with money. The poet Juvenal complained about senators openly keeping relationships with former prostitutes, which tells you that some women managed to climb the social ladder, if only a little. Of course, Juvenal complained about nearly everything. Reading his work is a bit like scrolling through a perpetual angry Twitter feed. So what did Romans actually think about prostitution? They tolerated it while despising the women who practiced it. Men who visited brothels faced no real stigma, unless they were mocked by poets, which was a common fate. But women who sold themselves were marked permanently as unclean. There's a grim irony in that, a society that depended on their existence, but refused them any shred of respect. A classic Roman contradiction, and one that feels strangely familiar even today. Let's drift a little further into the night streets of Rome. Picture narrow alleys lit by oil lamps, the shadows long against the walls, the smell of wine and smoke drifting from taverns. Somewhere, laughter breaks out in coarse voices. A woman leans in a doorway, hoping the next passerby has a coin to spare. A cart rattles past, carrying amphorae of cheap wine. And above it all, the insistent hum of a city that never really sleeps, where emperors plot in marble halls and ordinary people scrape by in crowded tenements. For the prostitutes of Rome, this was daily reality. Hard, dangerous, and inescapably public. Now, before we drift onward to the next set of peculiarities, such as how prostitutes interacted with religion and temples in Rome, pause for a moment. If you lived in the Eternal City 2,000 years ago, would you have been the type to sneak off to the Lupanar, or the type to tut disapprovingly while pretending not to notice? Be honest. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. When we last left the streets of Rome, we were wandering past taverns and brothels, oil lamps flickering against the walls, the smell of cheap wine clinging to the air. The prostitutes of Rome, the meretresses, stood in doorways or crouched in cramped stone rooms, making their living in ways that society despised yet depended upon. And now, let's drift onward, because there's another layer of irony worth exploring, the uneasy, sometimes hypocritical relationship between prostitution and religion in Rome. It may surprise you, or perhaps not at all, that the Romans, practical as they were, often blurred the lines between sacred and profane. They adored their gods, yes, but their gods were as flawed and complicated as the people who worshipped them. Jupiter was a serial adulterer, Venus was quite literally the goddess of sexual desire, and Mars was always running off to fight or to romance someone else's wife. Hardly paragons of family virtue. And so, for a society steeped in mythology where the gods themselves behaved like scandalous aristocrats, the presence of prostitution near temples and sacred spaces seemed less shocking than it might to us. In fact, some scholars believe there was a practice, borrowed from the East, then adapted clumsily into Roman culture, of what we'd now call sacred prostitution. The idea was that a woman might offer her body as a kind of religious service, dedicating her earnings or her act to a god or goddess. Was this common in Rome? Probably not as much as sensational writers liked to claim. But the idea lingered around the edges. Temples to Venus, in particular, were sometimes associated with sex workers. After all, what better way to honor the goddess of love than to celebrate, shall we say, love's more physical aspects? Let's picture it for a moment. You're a weary Roman man, maybe a soldier home from a campaign, or a merchant tired from haggling over olive oil prices. You pass by a temple gleaming in the afternoon sun. Inside, priests fuss over incense and chants. Outside, women linger, their clothing marking them unmistakably as prostitutes. Some may have claimed their work honored the goddess, others simply knew temples were reliable places to find customers. Men came to pray, men left donations, and men carried coins in their purses. Where there are men and money, there was always opportunity. And here's the strange part. Roman law did not forbid prostitutes from being near temples. There were occasional attempts to keep them away, especially during festivals meant to emphasize piety and restraint, but the enforcement was lax. After all, the line between respectable woman and prostitute was already being blurred by certain cult practices. Vestal virgins, for example, had to remain absolutely chaste, punished by death if they failed. Meanwhile, priestesses of Venus or Flora sometimes dressed provocatively, celebrated fertility with wild spring festivals, and encouraged open displays of sexuality. Roman religion was nothing if not inconsistent. Take the festival of Floralia, for instance. Held in honor of the goddess Flora, it was celebrated with drinking, dancing, and, according to the ever-scandalized Cicero, performances in which prostitutes stripped or acted in obscene plays. Imagine a city-wide spring break where the dividing line between sacred ritual and bawdy entertainment blurred into one long, chaotic street party. The prostitutes of Rome found these festivals to be golden opportunities. Demand rose, inhibitions fell, and suddenly their trade wasn't just tolerated, it was almost encouraged. And then, of course, there was Venus. The goddess of love and desire had temples all across Rome. Some women working as prostitutes styled themselves as her servants, whether sincerely or cynically. It gave a divine gloss to their otherwise despised profession. If someone sneered at them, they could shrug and say they were merely honoring the goddess, doing her work in their own way. Not that this excuse protected them from social stigma, but it may have helped them feel a little less discarded. And really, when society stacks the deck against you, claiming Venus as your employer is not the worst strategy. The emperors, naturally, had opinions on this tangled mess of sex and religion. Augustus, with his relentless obsession over morality laws, tried to restore old-fashioned family values by punishing adultery and rewarding legitimate marriage. But even he could not eradicate prostitution or its ties to temples. His successor, Tiberius, a man famous for retreating to Capri with a collection of questionable amusements, did little to improve matters. And Caligula, well, Caligula cheerfully erased boundaries altogether. He supposedly converted part of his palace into a brothel staffed by women of good families, just to scandalize senators. He even had coins collected as offerings, blending imperial authority with prostitution in the most shameless way possible. For a man who liked to call himself a god, it was all one grand, perverse performance. The association between religion and sex work wasn't unique to Rome, of course. The Greeks before them had similar stories, and in places like Babylon and Cyprus, sacred prostitution had more established traditions. But what Rome did best, what Rome always did best, was to absorb ideas from other cultures, strip them of context, and apply them in ways that suited Roman practicality. Sacred prostitution in Rome wasn't about mystical union with the divine. It was about convenience, profit, and a veneer of religious justification. It's worth pausing here to imagine what it felt like for the women themselves. You are standing outside a temple of Venus, your hair oiled, your clothes deliberately plain but revealing. Men walk by, some averting their eyes in public piety, others glancing quickly, then circling back when they think no one important is watching. Do you feel shame? Perhaps. Do you feel power? Occasionally. You know that the goddess of love is worshipped inside, that couples will come to her altar to pray for fertility, that brides will sacrifice doves before their weddings. And yet here you are, the living embodiment of Venus's less celebrated domain, commodified desire itself. You laugh at the hypocrisy because what else can you do? The presence of prostitutes around temples also created awkward situations for families. Imagine a father bringing his daughter to make an offering before her marriage, only to pass by half a dozen women propositioning customers at the temple steps. The official priests might scowl, the senators might mutter, but little changed. Rome was too vast, too sprawling, too full of contradictions to impose consistency. There's also evidence that some prostitutes left offerings in temples themselves. Small tokens, perhaps a coin or a figurine, thanking the gods for protection or for enough customers to get through another week. Religion, after all, wasn't reserved only for the respectable. Even the lowest ranked in society clung to the hope that the gods noticed them. And maybe Venus did. After all, she had her own history of being mocked and dismissed by the more serious Olympians, only to prove again and again that desire and beauty were forces no one could control. Perhaps the meretresses saw a little of themselves in her. But of course, not everyone was so tolerant. Conservative writers like Seneca or Juvenal complained bitterly about the corruption of morals, about prostitutes defiling sacred places. They liked to imagine a glorious past where Roman women were modest and virtuous, a past that almost certainly never existed. Nostalgia, as always, is a reliable way to avoid dealing with reality. Their words give us a sense of how prostitutes were judged, even when tolerated. They were always the convenient scapegoats, the walking examples of moral decay. As if senators accepting bribes, generals looting provinces, and emperors strangling rivals in the palace garden were not signs of decline far more worrying than a woman earning a few asses outside a temple. Still, the blending of prostitution and religion shaped Roman culture in subtle ways. The city itself absorbed the contradiction. You could walk a single street and see a temple, a tavern, and a lupanar all in a row. Sacred and profane existing side by side, like mismatched neighbors who simply learned to ignore each other. And that, in a way, was Rome in miniature. A civilization where lofty ideals were proclaimed in marble inscriptions, while daily life continued in all its messy, unvirtuous reality. Now let's drift a little further, toward the festivals again, because they reveal even more. The Floralia, as we mentioned, was notorious for prostitutes performing on stage, encouraged by the crowd. The Saturnalia, that wild December festival of role reversals and feasting, also loosened restrictions. Masters dined with slaves, gambling was permitted, and prostitutes likely found the streets alive with revelers looking to indulge. During these times, the usual stigma faded, if only for a few days. Everyone laughed, everyone drank, everyone pretended the rigid hierarchies of Roman life didn't matter. And then, once the holiday ended, the barriers went back up, and the women returned to their corner of society's disdain. That's one of the tragedies, really. For brief moments, prostitutes were folded into the communal joy of festivals, but never allowed to remain there. They were useful when it suited the crowd, invisible when it did not. Religion gave them moments of opportunity, but never redemption. Not in Roman eyes, anyway. Let's pause again and consider. If you had been in Rome, walking past the temples and the taverns, would you have seen these women as part of Venus's domain, or would you have looked away? Would you have dropped a coin in their hand, or judged them as corrupting the sacred? Tell me what you think in the comments, because the hypocrisy here is fascinating. And with that, let's drift onward, away from temples and gods, toward another corner of Roman life, the bathhouses. Because if there was ever a place where respectability and indulgence collided headlong, it was in the steamy, echoing rooms of the Roman baths. But we'll wander there slowly, letting the marble steps of the temples fade behind us. We've just stepped away from the temples, their incense curling into the Roman air, their priests muttering prayers while prostitutes lingered just outside the marble steps. Religion and desire uneasily coexisted, tolerated so long as no one made too much of a fuss. But let's drift now toward another set of doors, wide, heavy, and often decorated with carved dolphins or mosaics of cheerful attendants. We're entering the bathhouse, one of the great hubs of Roman daily life, and also, perhaps unsurprisingly, one of the great hubs of Roman prostitution. The Roman bath was not just a place to scrub the grime of the city off your body, though it certainly helped with that. It was part spa, part gym, part social club, and part gossip hub. Men and women alike visited baths, though usually at separate times or in separate facilities. Everyone from senators to slaves might bathe there, though naturally the quality of the bathhouse varied depending on where in the city you were. A luxurious complex built by an emperor gleamed with marble floors, painted ceilings, and hot water piped in through carefully engineered aqueducts. A cheap neighborhood bath was more like a steamy, crowded barn where the water smelled faintly of mildew and oil. Now, into this mix of sweat, soap, and chatter came the prostitutes. Bathhouses were ideal places to seek customers. Men came there to relax, to linger, and to spend. They reclined in the tepidarium, stretched on massage tables, or lounged in the caldarium's heavy steam. Their guard was down, their purses often not far away, and their sense of indulgence already primed. A woman sidling over with a suggestive smile fit the atmosphere rather well. It wasn't exactly a secret, either. Roman writers often hinted at extra services offered in baths. Some bathhouse owners explicitly hired prostitutes as part of the establishment. Others simply rented out small side rooms where couples could disappear briefly. And the line between masseuse and prostitute was, let's just say, extremely porous. Imagine a client asking for a back rub that very quickly became something else, while the attendants outside pretended not to notice. The architecture of the baths even encouraged it. Long corridors, small chambers tucked off to the side, curtained alcoves that could be entered and exited discreetly. Steam hung thick in the air, obscuring faces. Voices echoed, but no one paid much attention. If you were looking to conduct business, there were few places better. Of course, respectable women were not supposed to mingle in this way. Female prostitutes who worked in baths usually belonged to the lower classes, often slaves. Male prostitutes also operated there, especially for clients seeking younger boys. This was one of the darker realities of Roman sexuality, the exploitation of enslaved children and adolescents. While elite writers occasionally wrung their hands about morality, the practice was disturbingly common, and bathhouses were a prime location for it. It's one of those reminders that while the baths gleam in tourist photos today, their history was not always as clean as the marble suggests. Still, for many, the bath was simply part of the day. You worked in the morning, you bathed in the afternoon, and you emerged feeling lighter, oiled, and slightly poorer. Prostitutes woven into this rhythm were simply another accepted indulgence. The same way you might purchase a snack from a vendor or tip the slave who scraped the sweat from your back with a strigil, you might also slip a coin to a woman who followed you into a side room. No one asked too many questions. Moving away from the baths, let's wander down another familiar Roman haunt, the tavern. Now, taverns in Rome were lively, chaotic places. They were called popini, and they served cheap wine, salty snacks, and an atmosphere that hovered somewhere between friendly and dangerous. Respectable men were not supposed to spend too much time in taverns. Senators and knights had reputations to protect. But soldiers, merchants, freedmen, and the poorer classes filled them nightly, their cups refilled endlessly by cheerful or sullen innkeepers. And where there was drink, there was sex. Taverns were one of the most common places for prostitutes to work. Some were directly owned by pimps who combined lodging, alcohol, and prostitution into a neat little business. Others were independent women who simply stood outside the doors, propositioning customers as they staggered in or out. You can almost picture it, the roar of drunken voices, dice clattering on the table, the heavy smell of sour wine in the air, and a woman leaning casually against the doorframe, calling out a price to anyone who looked her way. The Romans themselves associated taverns with loose morals. To spend time in one was already slightly shameful, to be a woman working there was doubly so. Juvenal once described taverns as places of vice and ruin, which is a bit dramatic, but not entirely wrong. They were noisy, smoky, and occasionally violent. Fights broke out over cheating dice games, unpaid debts, or accusations of watered wine. Prostitutes working in such places faced real danger from drunk customers and little legal recourse when things went badly. Yet for all their risks, taverns provided steady traffic and steady business. A man already drunk and gambling was much easier to convince. Let's linger a moment in one of these taverns. The walls are blackened with soot from oil lamps. Clay cups clink against rough wooden tables. A dog wanders between the legs of benches, hoping for scraps of bread. In the corner, men argue over a dice throw, their voices rising. At another table, a couple leans close, whispering, though they're hardly discreet. And near the entrance, a woman waits, her eyes sharp, her tone practiced. She knows the rhythm of drunkenness, the exact moment when a man shifts from rowdy to pliable, from hesitant to eager. She steps forward then, and business is made. It's worth noting that prostitutes themselves often drank little. They could not afford to dull their wits. Too much wine meant less ability to negotiate, less ability to spot danger. A sober woman in a room full of drunk men was vulnerable enough without numbing her senses. So while customers swayed and slurred, she remained watchful, calculating. Perhaps she even carried a small knife under her cloak, just in case. Rome may have tolerated prostitution, but it rarely protected prostitutes. Survival depended on their own alertness. Taverns also blurred lines between entertainment and sex. Music, dice, and dancing often accompanied the drinking. Prostitutes sometimes doubled as performers, singing, playing an instrument, or simply laughing at men's jokes to loosen their coin purses. A skilled courtesan might weave flattery into her sales pitch, making a man feel witty, admired, or powerful before leading him outside. The art of seduction was as valuable as the act itself. Interestingly, taverns were not exclusively for men. Women did drink there, though they were often judged harshly for it. A woman seen in a tavern at night was usually assumed to be a prostitute, whether or not she actually was. The stigma of the place tainted any woman present. Respectable matrons were expected to stay home, weaving or managing household slaves. To step into a tavern was to risk one's reputation. For prostitutes, that risk didn't matter. Their reputation was already marked. So between the baths and the taverns, we see a pattern. Roman society separated its respectable public face from its indulgent private desires, but only barely. Places meant for relaxation and leisure naturally became spaces for sex work. Everyone knew it, everyone accepted it, and yet everyone pretended to be shocked when poets or satirists pointed it out. It's the kind of collective denial that societies excel at. The overlap also made prostitution almost invisible, part of the city's daily hum. A man could leave his cramped insula apartment, stop by the baths, chat with friends, slip into a side room with a prostitute, and then head to a tavern for a drink. By the time he walked home under the moonlight, he had enjoyed nearly every vice the city offered, yet still considered himself a respectable citizen. His wife, of course, was expected to remain utterly faithful, but he would not see the contradiction. Rome's double standards were as vast as its aqueducts. One can't help but wonder how these women felt about their lives intersecting with Rome's leisure culture. Did they resent the smell of sour wine clinging to their skin, or the endless steam that left their hair damp from hours in the baths? Did they grow numb to the jeers of drunk men, or did they laugh quietly at the absurdity of it all? We'll never know for sure. The sources were written almost entirely by elite men who sneered at prostitutes while quietly using them. The women's voices are silent, their thoughts lost. But perhaps, in the crackling of a lamp in a Pompeian tavern fresco, or in the graffiti scrawled on a bathhouse wall, we catch faint echoes of their humor and resignation. Before we wander onward to explore how prostitution intersected with Roman law, let's pause for a moment. Imagine yourself in that steamy bathhouse, oil on your skin, or in that noisy tavern with dice tumbling across the table. Would you have been tempted to slip into one of those side rooms? Or would you have left quickly, pretending you saw nothing? Leave your honest answer in the comments. I'm curious where you'd land in the Eternal City's social maze. Let's drift a little further into the quieter corners of Roman life, where the reality of prostitution intersected with something that Romans themselves valued above almost anything else: reputation. The Romans, after all, were a society obsessed with what other people thought of them. To lose one's dignitas, your social standing, your sense of respectability, was considered a sort of death in itself. Yet prostitution thrived in a culture that was both rigid about morality and endlessly pragmatic about indulging in pleasures. It was the kind of contradiction Rome excelled at. A senator could thunder in the forum about the decay of morals, then casually slip out in the evening to visit a brothel. It was not hypocrisy in the modern sense, at least not to them. It was just the natural order of things. The state kept its ideals polished and shiny in public, while the private world was allowed to sink comfortably into vice. The double standard was baked in from the start. Male citizens, especially those of higher rank, could purchase sex freely and still retain their reputations. No one thought much of it. But for women of any respectable background, engaging in sex outside marriage was devastating. A woman could lose her entire social position with a single accusation, while her husband might stroll back from the Subura smelling of wine and perfume and face no consequences at all. To be a prostitute in Rome, therefore, was not simply to sell your body, it was to exist outside the normal rules of respectability entirely. The stigma was total and permanent. Once you registered yourself with the aediles and accepted the title of meretrix, you could never wash it off. Even if you managed to escape the trade and marry, the label followed you like a curse. Romans did not believe in moral rehabilitation. Once tainted, always tainted. And yet, prostitutes were everywhere. The demand was so high that even the most moralizing emperors learned to accept their presence. Augustus, who loved to parade his moral reforms, never tried to ban prostitution outright. He knew it was impossible. Better to regulate it, tax it, and quietly pretend that it was serving some higher purpose. Which, in a way, it was. Roman writers sometimes spoke of prostitution as a kind of safety valve. If men had access to prostitutes, the argument went, then they would be less likely to seduce respectable wives or daughters. In other words, the shame was dumped on the prostitutes so the rest of society could stay safe. It's a convenient moral framework, though not exactly flattering for anyone involved. Day-to-day life for prostitutes could vary dramatically depending on where they worked. The lowest rung was the brothel slave, often purchased from abroad, dragged into Rome, and forced into service with no say at all. These women endured brutal hours, little food, and constant exposure to disease. Their workrooms were often nothing more than stone alcoves with a curtain or wooden door, the kind you still see carved into the ruins of Pompeii's Lupanar. Imagine lying on a straw mattress that had seen hundreds of visitors before you, while the noise of others carried through the thin walls, and a lamp flickered with greasy smoke above your head. It was not glamorous. And yet, the walls of these little cells were covered in crude graffiti, sometimes carved by clients, sometimes by the women themselves. Names, little sketches, insults, even complaints about stingy customers. It's one of the few traces of their voices that survives. Further up the ladder were the independents. These were women who rented their own rooms, or even owned small houses where they worked. Some attached themselves to taverns, offering services alongside the wine and stew. A few advertised on the streets, standing in doorways, wearing revealing clothes or brightly dyed wigs to attract attention. They were still scorned, of course, but they at least had some freedom to set terms. A lucky few could even gather a regular clientele and make a modest living. But modest was the key word. No matter how many clients they served, prostitutes rarely amassed wealth. The constant expenses, rent, clothing, bribes, taxes to the aediles, kept most of them in a cycle of poverty. The occasional tale of a courtesan who grew rich was the exception that proved the rule, a story repeated more often than it actually happened. At the very top, however, were the elite courtesans, the ones who styled themselves not as prostitutes, but as companions. These were the women who entertained poets, actors, or even senators. They were witty, educated, and carefully cultivated an air of sophistication. They appeared at dinner parties as if they belonged there, though everyone knew they did not. Romans tended to write about them with a mixture of fascination and distaste. Some were immortalized in poetry, their beauty or cruelty etched into verse for centuries. Others became mistresses of powerful men, living in luxury for a while, only to be discarded when their patron tired of them. Theirs was a precarious kind of success, always dependent on the favor of men, never truly secure. But compared to the Lupanar, it was paradise. The law, meanwhile, tried its best to keep things orderly. Prostitutes were required to wear certain clothes that marked their status. It might be a toga, oddly enough. In Rome, respectable women did not wear togas, those were for men. A woman in a toga was sending a signal, and not a flattering one. In fact, it was often used as a legal punishment. Women convicted of adultery could be stripped of their stola, the dress of the matron, and forced to wear a toga instead. It marked them as dishonored, practically indistinguishable from a prostitute. Imagine a piece of clothing that announced your entire social downfall every time you stepped outside. That was Roman fashion at its most cruel. The regulations extended even to names. Registered prostitutes were sometimes forbidden from using respectable Roman names like Claudia or Cornelia. Instead, they had to choose humbler names, often Greek or foreign-sounding, which immediately marked them as outsiders. Language itself became another barrier between them and the rest of society. Even if a woman had been born free, her registration erased her respectability. It's worth noting that once you registered, there was no official way back. You could not erase your name from the rolls. Rome kept you there for life. It was bureaucracy at its most unforgiving. But for all the stigma, Roman men never stopped visiting. In fact, some of the loudest moral critics were the most enthusiastic customers. Take Cato the Elder, for instance, the famous censor who preached endlessly about discipline and traditional values. He admitted, quite casually, that he once saw a young man leaving a brothel and congratulated him. Better, he said, that the young man visit a prostitute than meddle with another man's wife. Cato considered this practical morality. Of course, he failed to reflect on how such practicality destroyed the lives of the women involved, but that sort of selective blindness was a Roman specialty. Naturally, things only got stranger as time went on. Under certain emperors, the lines between prostitutes and performers blurred. Actors, singers, and dancers were also considered dishonorable professions. To take the stage was to step outside respectability, much like standing in a brothel doorway. That meant many performers doubled as prostitutes, and vice versa. A night at the theater might include both entertainment and a discreet business transaction. Romans pretended to be shocked, but they kept attending. They loved the spectacle too much to stay away. Hypocrisy was, as always, a Roman art form. And then, of course, there was the emperor's involvement. Some emperors tolerated prostitution. Others used it as a stage for their own eccentricities. Caligula, for instance, is said to have turned part of the imperial palace into a brothel, staffed with noble women and men, all forced to serve his guests. Was this true, or just a slander invented after his assassination? Hard to say. Roman historians loved to smear their emperors with lurid tales, and Caligula was an easy target. But even if the specific story was false, the fact that people found it believable says a great deal. The idea of the emperor running a palace brothel was not beyond the imagination of Rome. That tells us everything we need to know about how common and how visible prostitution really was. And so the trade endured, despite all the shame, all the moralizing, all the regulations. The truth is that prostitution in Rome was not an aberration, it was woven into the fabric of daily life. From the grandest banquet to the dingiest alleyway, it lingered in the background, both condemned and essential. It propped up the social order by absorbing the desires that might otherwise disrupt respectable households. It generated revenue for the state, filled the taverns, and even inspired the poets. Everyone pretended to despise it, while quietly making use of it. That contradiction was never resolved, not in the Republic, not in the Empire. Rome simply carried on with both ideals and vices balanced, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. So let's pause here, before we drift onward again. If you had lived in Rome, would you have accepted this contradiction, that prostitution was shameful, yet necessary? Or would you have tried to reform it, knowing how deeply ingrained it was? Leave a thought in the comments. I'd be curious to see how modern minds would navigate an ancient double standard. Let's settle in again, and drift a little further along the cobbled streets of ancient Rome. By now you can almost hear the faint chatter of taverns, the clink of cups, the shuffle of sandals in the Subura. And always there in the background, sometimes in the open, sometimes in shadow, was the trade of sex. To understand it more fully, we should wander into the practical side of things, because as much as Roman writers liked to moralize about passion or lust, what really drove prostitution was money. The whole system was built on coins exchanged quickly, tucked into hands, or counted out at the end of the day. Rome itself thrived on commerce, and even its vices were part of the economy. For most prostitutes, the pay was low. A visit might cost just a few asses, small copper coins worth less than a loaf of bread. Some graffiti from Pompeii records prices as laughably cheap, the sort of sum that even a poor laborer could afford after a day's work. That tells us two things. First, prostitution was accessible to almost every man in the city, not just the wealthy. Second, the women themselves rarely saw much profit. A brothel slave might receive nothing at all, her earnings handed straight to her owner. An independent woman had to pay rent, bribes, and fees to the aediles who oversaw registrations. By the time she counted her coins, the profit might be pitiful. There were exceptions, of course. Courtesans who rose to fame could charge enormous sums, especially if they cultivated an air of exclusivity. These women were less about quick encounters in dim alcoves and more about extended arrangements with wealthy patrons. They dined in fine houses, wore expensive clothes, and sometimes appeared in poetry as objects of longing or ridicule. But theirs was a fragile wealth. If a patron turned his favor elsewhere, the courtesan's position could collapse overnight. Unlike a senator's daughter, she had no family name to fall back on. Her fortune was always borrowed, never secure. The money itself often came in the smallest denominations, which carried their own quiet indignities. Imagine working long hours, only to be paid in handfuls of copper coins, each sticky with sweat from passing through dozens of hands that day. To count them out would take time, and yet you needed everyone to pay for bread, oil, or rent. Larger coins of silver and gold circulated among Rome's elite, but in the brothels, it was the tiny copper pieces that changed hands the most. Rome's economy of desire was, in a literal sense, built on the smallest change. Taxes added another layer. The Roman state never missed a chance to squeeze revenue from its people, and prostitution was no exception. Prostitutes were registered, and their names carefully recorded. This was not out of moral concern, but to ensure proper taxation. To exist outside the rolls was to risk punishment. It is striking, really, that Rome never tried to hide prostitution in the shadows. The bureaucracy acknowledged it, filed it away, and added it to the ledger. The empire thrived on paperwork, even for its vices. You could be scorned by society, but you still had a tax number. Beyond money, there were the small details of daily work. A prostitute in the Suburra might rise with the noise of carts rattling over stone streets. She might step outside to sweep the doorway of her rented room, arranging a little stool or lamp to signal that she was available. Some wore brightly colored wigs, often blonde, imported from Germanic tribes. A wig was not only eye-catching, but also exotic, a way to stand out among the crowd. Others painted their faces, though Roman moralists scoffed at cosmetics, declaring that they were only fit for prostitutes. In a way, makeup itself became a social marker. A little powder on your cheeks might invite whispers, whether you worked in a brothel or not. The line between respectable matron and woman of the night was often drawn by the judgment of onlookers, not the law. Inside the brothels, the atmosphere was both mundane and grim. Archaeologists have uncovered the narrow rooms, the stone couches, the faint remains of paintings above the doors. Some of these frescoes were explicit, perhaps serving as advertisements, or maybe just as decoration for a clientele not known for refinement. Imagine walking down a corridor lit by smoky oil lamps, hearing the creak of doors, and seeing painted figures engaged in every possible act above the thresholds. It was not subtle. Subtlety was not the point. The clientele themselves ranged across classes. A poor laborer might save a few coins to visit a brothel near the Suburra. A soldier passing through the city might do the same. Wealthier men might prefer a courtesan, or send for a woman to come to their home under the guise of entertainment. But in essence, prostitution was one of the few places where Roman society blurred. In the brothel, the senator and the sailor might pass in the same hall, both stripped of their dignity, both fumbling for coins. It was, in its way, a leveling space. Though, of course, only the men walked out with their reputations intact. Disease was an ever-present risk. The Romans had no understanding of germs, but they noticed patterns. Certain ailments, particularly those affecting the skin or genitals, spread widely among prostitutes and their clients. Writers like Juvenal sneered about the filth of the brothels, linking it to disease and decay. But despite the warnings, men kept coming. As with so many things in Roman life, desire outweighed caution. The city lived in a constant balance between pleasure and peril. Another layer of complexity was slavery. Many prostitutes in Rome were enslaved women, brought from conquered provinces. Gauls, Greeks, Syrians, and Egyptians filled the brothels, their accents and foreign features adding to their appeal. Rome's empire was built on conquest, and its sexual economy reflected that. To visit a brothel was not only to purchase sex, but often to partake in the spoils of empire. For the women, it meant their bodies became just another form of plunder, traded endlessly in the heart of the city. The casual cruelty of it barely registered to Roman citizens, who had grown accustomed to seeing slaves in every corner of life. But even here, there were exceptions worth pausing over. Some freed women chose prostitution voluntarily, or at least more voluntarily than their enslaved counterparts. For a woman without family connections or inheritance, the options were limited. You might work as a washerwoman, a spinner, a tavern maid, or you might turn to sex work, where at least the pay could, on good days, be higher. It was not an enviable choice, but it was still a choice. Roman society offered very few paths for poor women, and prostitution remained one of the most accessible, if degrading. The contrast between public shame and private necessity played out constantly. A man might publicly condemn prostitutes, yet privately visit them. A woman might be shunned as dishonorable, yet depended on by men who demanded her services. Even in literature, prostitutes were often treated as stock characters, figures of ridicule or cautionary tales, yet their presence in the city was so obvious that no one could ignore it. Rome both despised and depended on them, a contradiction it never attempted to resolve. It's telling that some of the earliest Christian writers seized on this hypocrisy. They pointed to prostitution as proof of Rome's moral decay, as if the entire empire might collapse under the weight of its sins. And yet, even those writers could not deny that prostitution had existed long before Rome, and would continue long after. The problem, if one wishes to call it that, was not uniquely Roman. But Rome had made it particularly visible, particularly bureaucratic, and particularly embedded in daily life. As the empire expanded, so too did its sexual economy. Garrison towns on the frontiers had their own brothels, often staffed with enslaved locals. Soldiers, far from home and living in grim conditions, became eager customers. For them, prostitutes were not only a comfort, but sometimes the only form of female company available. In this sense, prostitution was tied not only to the city, but to the empire itself. Wherever Roman power extended, the trade followed. It was as much a feature of Roman expansion as roads or aqueducts. When we picture the grandeur of Rome, the marble temples, the triumphal processions, the statues of emperors, it's easy to forget these quieter, seedier realities. But they were just as much a part of the empire as the Senate or the Colosseum. For every senator debating lofty matters, there were dozens of prostitutes waiting in alleys. For every triumphal arch built to celebrate conquest, there were women in brothels serving the conquerors. The story of Rome cannot be told honestly without them. And so, as we let this part drift to a close, perhaps ask yourself, if you were a poor Roman woman, with little education, no dowry, and no family connections, what choice would you have made? Would you endure grinding labor for pennies, or turn to the one trade that at least offered the possibility of survival, even at the cost of permanent stigma? There's no right answer, but it's the kind of question worth mulling over in the quiet hours. Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes reflecting on old dilemmas tells us more about our own lives than we expect. By now you may have noticed that prostitution in ancient Rome was not a neatly defined world, but rather a sprawling, untidy tangle of lives, rules, and compromises. To imagine it clearly, we should step into the rhythm of an ordinary day, though of course the idea of ordinary was slippery in a city where wealth and status determined almost everything. For the woman working in a back alley brothel, the day began in dimness, with the creak of wooden shutters opening to the light, the smell of bread baking somewhere nearby, and the dull anxiety of knowing she would soon be on display again. She might have had little more than a crust of bread and watered wine for breakfast, eaten quickly before the flow of customers began. Some brothels opened early, catering to men who had errands in the city and wanted a quick diversion before work. Others stayed busiest at night, when the taverns emptied, when the lamps were lit along the streets, and when inhibitions fell away with a rising scent of wine. A woman might spend her day waiting, listening for footsteps in the corridor, counting her coins, or gossiping with the others between visits. Time itself moved strangely in such places. A few minutes of hurried work with one client, followed by an hour of idleness before another appeared. The boredom, in some ways, was as oppressive as the labor. Those who worked outside brothels, the so-called independents, had a slightly different rhythm. They might position themselves in busy spots, the circus grounds, the entrances to bathhouses, or the steps of temples where men inevitably loitered. Some carried small lanterns at night, glowing signals of availability. Others wore distinctive clothing, wigs, or jewelry to catch the eye. Imagine the clamor of a Roman street, the vendors shouting about olives and fish, the creak of wagons, the bray of animals, and amid it all, women standing quietly, offering a different kind of commodity, one the city preferred to pretend was shameful, though it never turned away. The money, always the money, tells us much about their reality. Most prostitutes charged so little that it is difficult for us to reconcile the numbers with survival. A few copper asses for a visit, perhaps the equivalent of a modern snack, was all that many earned. One wonders how they managed to eat, clothe themselves, and pay rent. The answer is they often didn't manage at all, sinking into debt or relying on pimps, tavern keepers, or even kind clients to provide the basics. Poverty clung to the trade as persistently as stigma. Yet in rare cases, women rose higher, charging in silver or even gold, especially if they had the charm, wit, or beauty to captivate wealthy men. Roman poetry is full of references to such women, though whether the poems made their lives easier or simply mocked them depends on the verse. And then there were the laws, those endless Roman laws that sought to control, categorize, and ultimately confine. Once registered, a prostitute could never escape her status. Her name was inked into official rolls, a bureaucratic branding that lasted a lifetime. To be delisted was impossible. A freedwoman who turned to sex work was recorded forever as a meretrix, no matter what she did later. It is one of the grimmer features of Rome, a society so consumed with record-keeping that it would not allow even the smallest mercy of forgetting. Imagine trying to start anew, only to find the state itself reminding you, at every turn, that your past could never be erased. This permanence is what made the label so devastating. A respectable matron could, at least in theory, recover from scandal if her family rallied around her. But a prostitute's shame was etched into public memory, backed by the full force of bureaucracy. Even her children bore the weight of her status. Sons and daughters of prostitutes were considered tainted, excluded from certain honors, forever marked by their mother's profession. Respectability in Rome was as hereditary as property, and dishonor, too, could be inherited. It is a reminder that prostitution in Rome was not just about sex, it was about an entire system of exclusion, reinforced by law, custom, and prejudice. Despite all this, the trade endured. Men of every class continued to buy sex, and women of every background, slave, freed, sometimes even freeborn, continued to sell it. Rome could not rid itself of prostitution, because it was not an aberration but a reflection of the city's own structure. A society built on slavery, conquest, and hierarchy inevitably produced such an economy. What is striking is not that prostitution existed, but how openly it was acknowledged, how thoroughly it was woven into law and literature, and how casually it was both scorned and used. For those caught in it, the work could be numbing, but also dangerous. Violence was always a possibility, whether from drunken clients, from pimps, or from officials who treated prostitutes as disposable. Unlike respectable women, they had little legal recourse. To strike a prostitute was hardly considered a crime. After all, she was already dishonorable. Some men even viewed violence as part of the transaction, indulging impulses they would never dare show to a wife or daughter. The vulnerability was constant, and the city did little to protect those it had already branded as unworthy. And yet, in small human ways, the women carved out pieces of life for themselves. They laughed, gossiped, decorated their rooms with little trinkets, scratched jokes or complaints into walls. In Pompey's Lupanar, graffiti records the names of women alongside comments like, "Marcellus was here," or "I had a good time for 2 asses." Crude, perhaps, but also strangely humanizing. These fragments remind us that prostitutes were not only symbols in moral debates, but individuals with voices, even if faint, echoing across centuries. We should also pause on the role of foreignness, because much of Roman prostitution was tied to the empire's appetite for the exotic. Blonde wigs, as mentioned, came from Germanic captives. Syrian women were praised, or mocked, for their sensuality. Greeks, Egyptians, Gauls, all found themselves dragged into Roman brothels, their identities turned into marketing. Rome did not just conquer territories, it consumed their bodies, folding them into its economy of desire. To be foreign in Rome was often to be eroticized, commodified, and reduced to a novelty. One can sense, beneath the literary flourishes, the deep imbalance of power at work. Religion, too, lurked around the edges. The official state cults did not endorse prostitution, but certain foreign cults were rumored to mingle sexuality with worship. Temples of Venus were sometimes associated with prostitutes, though whether they truly worked within the sacred spaces or simply lingered nearby is uncertain. The line between sacred and profane blurred in the popular imagination. Romans themselves often made jokes about Venus being the patron of prostitutes, as if the goddess of love had stooped to become their celestial madam. It is not clear the women took any comfort from this, but at least it provided a kind of cultural explanation for their work. If even the gods indulged, then surely mortals could as well. As the centuries went on, prostitution adapted to the changing empire. Under stricter emperors, it retreated slightly into shadows. Under more indulgent rulers, it spilled more openly into streets and palaces. Some emperors tried to restrict it with clothing laws, while others, like Caligula, supposedly turned it into a personal stage for excess. The fluctuations tell us less about the prostitutes themselves, and more about how Rome's elite projected their anxieties onto them. They were a convenient scapegoat, a visible symbol of decadence whenever someone wanted to blame society's decline. That prostitution had existed long before Rome, and would exist long after, was conveniently ignored. And so we find ourselves circling back to the same irony. A society that built monuments to its greatness also filled its walls with graffiti about brothel prices. A city that demanded dignity from its citizens simultaneously ensured that thousands of women could never possess any. Rome carried its contradictions proudly, never resolving them, perhaps never intending to. The empire was too large, too messy, to bother with such consistency. It simply lived with its hypocrisies, the way it lived with its aqueducts, its temples, and its endless appetite for conquest. As we let this section fade into quiet, perhaps consider this. If you were a poor Roman man, coins jingling in your pocket, would you have felt shame visiting a brothel, or would you have accepted it as ordinary, as common as buying bread? And if you were a woman faced with the limited paths of Roman poverty, would you have chosen the stigma of prostitution, or the equally grinding labor of spinning, washing, or serving in a tavern? Neither option was enviable, but survival rarely is. Leave your reflections in the comments. Sometimes history is less about judging and more about imagining ourselves in impossible choices. By now, you've probably gathered that Rome had a strange talent for regulating things it never really respected. And nowhere was this more obvious than in its laws about prostitution. The Romans, in their endless appetite for rules, forms, and fines, created a curious little web of bureaucracy that hovered around prostitutes like an annoying gnat. It never really swatted them down completely, but it never quite left them alone either. At the heart of it all was registration. Yes, believe it or not, in the Eternal City you couldn't simply decide to stand in the street and declare yourself open for business. Technically, you had to register with the aediles, the magistrates responsible for markets, streets, and what we might politely call public order. Imagine the scene: a young woman, or sometimes a man, standing before the stony-faced officials, giving their name, their place of origin, and, awkwardly, their chosen professional title. This was not an occupation that left much room for glamour. Once you registered, you were officially stamped as a prostitute in the eyes of the state. There was no going back. The record stayed. And registration mattered, because without it, you risked legal trouble. Rome wasn't exactly shy about cracking down on unregistered workers. The law saw them as illicit traders, people who slipped outside the taxable, controllable bounds of society. If you were caught working without your name on the books, fines could be imposed. Worse, you might be subjected to public shaming, which in Rome was almost worse than the fine itself. But let's be clear, this wasn't about morals. The Romans weren't suddenly seized by puritanical horror. The real point was control and revenue. By registering prostitutes, the city ensured it could tax them. That's right, the state was always ready to claim its cut. The money collected supposedly helped fund public projects, which means, in a small and ironic way, Rome's aqueducts and markets may have been financed by the labors of the city's sex workers. The empire, after all, was built on many kinds of labor, some less acknowledged than others. Of course, the hypocrisy was staggering. Senators and elites might sneer at prostitutes in public, yet happily keep them in private. Wealthy men hired them regularly, even while calling for restrictions on their visibility. In one particularly absurd example, Augustus himself introduced moral reforms meant to encourage family values. He outlawed adultery and punished it harshly, Yet prostitution was allowed to continue because, as one senator supposedly reasoned, it was better for men to seek out prostitutes than to disrupt honorable households. In other words, the very institution was defended as a way to protect Roman marriages, by allowing men a convenient outlet. This reveals the twisted Roman view of women's bodies. Respectable women were to be preserved, guarded, and shielded, while prostitutes were seen as a kind of necessary sponge, absorbing male desire so that good women didn't have to. If you're shaking your head at the logic, you're not alone. Many ancient commentators did too, though usually not out loud. Then there was the matter of clothing. Roman prostitutes often had to follow strict visual markers so they couldn't be mistaken for respectable women. One common rule was that they had to wear a toga. This is amusing because, in most of Roman life, the toga was the outfit of a male citizen. Women were supposed to wear the stola, a long draped garment that represented modesty and virtue. Prostitutes, however, were denied that privilege. By putting them in togas, society essentially stripped them of femininity, citizenship, and modesty all at once. It was a symbolic way of saying, you are not like other women. And so, you might wander through Rome and spot a figure in a toga, only to realize it was not a senator hurrying to the forum, but a woman advertising her trade. A curious inversion, and one that made prostitutes visually distinct, even if some probably found ways to bend the rules. The laws also reached into bizarre details about pricing. Some evidence suggests that prostitutes were expected to charge modest, regulated sums, at least the lower-class ones. The state didn't want ordinary men bankrupted by indulgence, nor did it want sex workers amassing too much wealth. This, of course, created an atmosphere where bribes, backroom deals, and under-the-table arrangements flourished. Whenever humans are involved, regulation never quite works the way it's supposed to. And in Rome, where corruption was practically a civic tradition, one imagines plenty of coins quietly changing hands without a magistrate's knowledge. But perhaps the strangest part of Roman legal thinking was how it affected social rank. Once you were registered as a prostitute, your legal status dropped. You were no longer allowed to marry a respectable citizen, not even if you left the profession. Your word carried less weight in court. You were branded, legally and socially, as a person outside the boundaries of honor. This brand was permanent. Even freed slaves who had once registered had to live with the stigma forever. In a society so obsessed with status and hierarchy, this meant prostitutes could never truly escape their role. Still, many found ways to live with it. Some leaned into their marginality, making the most of their trade, earning decent money, and sometimes supporting households of their own. Others aimed for the long shot, catching the eye of a wealthy man who might elevate them as a mistress, or even, in rare cases, set them up comfortably in life. For every 10 workers stuck in grim conditions, there might be one who carved out a measure of stability. It wasn't freedom, but it was survival. And yet, the laws remained. Hovering, nagging, shaping every detail of their lives. Whether it was the toga rule, the taxes, or the marriage ban, prostitutes were always being reminded of where they stood in the Roman order. Society used them, relied on them, even taxed them to fund itself, but denied them dignity at every turn. A paradox so neat it almost seems designed. Now, while the legal framework gives us plenty to think about, the lived experience of these laws is where things become vivid. Imagine being forced into a toga you didn't want to wear, walking the streets while knowing anyone who saw you would know exactly what you were. Imagine lining up before officials to declare your name and occupation, while watching scribes scratch it into records that would outlive you. There's something almost bureaucratically cruel about it, a reminder that Roman pragmatism could be as stifling as it was efficient. Let's drift onward though, because the laws weren't the only source of irony. The Romans also loved to moralize in literature, producing endless poems, plays, and commentaries that simultaneously mocked and lusted after prostitutes. Authors like Juvenal sneered about women who sold themselves, while clearly knowing full well that their readers, too, were likely customers. The hypocrisy wasn't hidden. It was practically a national pastime. As you can see, Roman law wrapped prostitution in contradictions. Officially tolerated, yet legally stigmatized. Taxed, yet dishonored. Necessary, yet despised. It is one of the clearest windows into Roman values, so sharp, yet so muddled. And I'll leave you with a little question to ponder as you drift into the next section. If you had lived in Rome, surrounded by these rules and hypocrisies, what do you think you would have done? Would you have registered, paid the taxes, worn the toga? Or tried to slip by unnoticed, risking the magistrate's wrath? Tell me in the comments what choice you would have made. Now, as we meander through the streets of Rome, it becomes clear that prostitution was not merely a matter of law or labor, but also a social and cultural phenomenon, one woven into the literature, art, and gossip of the city. Romans loved nothing more than to mock and moralize, and prostitutes were often at the center of their commentary. They appeared as characters in poems and plays, as symbols of decadence or cautionary tales, yet the writers who scorned them were rarely immune to desire themselves. There is something quietly amusing about a society that can write elaborate satires condemning behavior that it simultaneously indulges. One of the more fascinating aspects of this cultural perception was the distinction Romans drew between different kinds of prostitutes. The elite courtesans, those educated and charming women who could entertain senators or poets, were at once admired and distrusted. They were clever, witty, and sometimes even manipulative, using their intelligence to secure more comfortable lives. In literature, they were depicted as dangerous temptresses, yet their very danger made them objects of fascination. A well-placed remark, a witty observation, or an artfully applied blush could elevate a courtesan in the eyes of men of influence, creating opportunities that went far beyond mere survival. Yet these opportunities were fragile, entirely dependent on the whims of men. Once favor shifted, even the cleverest courtesan could find herself back in the subura, her small luxuries evaporated overnight. Meanwhile, lower-class prostitutes were often invisible in literary accounts except as objects of ridicule or warning. Plays and satires used them for cheap humor, portraying them as greedy, foolish, or lewd. The subtle irony is that these portrayals were usually written by men who frequented the same brothels. Juvenal, for instance, delighted in mocking the women of Rome, while his own writings suggest he understood, all too well, the appeal and complexity of their lives. One can almost imagine him smirking quietly as he composed a biting verse, fully aware that his readers, or perhaps even he himself, were regular customers. It's a peculiar combination of scorn and acknowledgement that runs throughout Roman literature. Beyond literature, prostitutes had to navigate the social hierarchy of the city itself. Rome was obsessed with rank and status, and even marginal citizens could recognize the invisible rules at work. A freedwoman might attempt to pass herself off as independent, hoping to secure a patron or perhaps even a more lasting connection. But the social mark of prostitution followed her, visible in her clothing, her speech, and, importantly, in the assumptions of those around her. Every interaction carried the potential for judgment or advantage. One could almost chart the degrees of vulnerability. Slave, freed, independent, courtesan, each rung in this ladder came with its own combination of exposure and opportunity. Even so, there were moments of ordinary human life amid the labor. Prostitutes formed friendships, rivalries, and networks of support. They shared gossip about clients, traded small favors, and, occasionally, celebrated a rare payday. Archaeological evidence hints at small personal touches in their living spaces. Graffiti expressing humor, desire, or frustration, perhaps a simple drawing scratched into a wall, depicting a fleeting moment of life. These traces, faint as they are, remind us that beyond the public scorn and official scrutiny, these women were people navigating a difficult world, finding small ways to assert themselves, and marking time as best they could. The relationship between prostitutes and their clients was often transactional, but it was rarely impersonal. Romans were aware that a woman's skills, beauty, and personality could command higher prices. In some cases, patrons developed ongoing relationships, providing gifts or even temporary housing. One can imagine the quiet routines of such arrangements. A woman preparing a modest meal, applying her makeup with care, arranging the room to seem inviting, all the while knowing that her comfort, and perhaps her survival, depended on maintaining favor. The power dynamics were complex. She had little legal power, but social influence in small, personal ways. In some circumstances, a woman might be able to influence the choices of a man, redirecting his desires or curbing his impulses, all while remaining aware that the balance could shift at any moment. It is also worth noting that sexuality itself was, in Rome, a curious mix of morality, pragmatism, and performative art. Male citizens were permitted, and even expected, to indulge, while women faced almost universal restrictions. Prostitutes existed in a space deliberately outside conventional moral rules. This separation allowed men to maintain their public reputations, while women bore the brunt of judgment and physical labor. The city's structures, laws, tax systems, and cultural expectations conspired to enforce this division. And yet, despite the inequity, some women were able to carve niches for themselves, finding a measure of independence within the confines of a trade designed to deny it. An unexpected feature of Roman prostitution was the role of foreigners and slaves. Many women were imported from across the empire: Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, Gauls. Their foreignness added to their allure. Some were prized for exotic looks or distinctive cultural traits, and some were literally depicted as embodiments of sensuality or danger. For the women themselves, being foreign often meant an even more precarious position. Their lack of familial connections or local networks could make them more dependent on brothel owners, pimps, or patrons. Yet foreign women also had opportunities. Their uniqueness could be marketed, their skills or appearances commanding higher fees in the right circumstances. Life was a careful balance of risk and advantage, with every transaction measured in coins and reputation alike. Even among elites, Roman men seemed to maintain a fascination with prostitutes. The Emperor Caligula, for instance, is famously rumored to have transformed sections of the palace into temporary brothels, hosting parties that blended pleasure, power, and excess. Whether these tales were true or merely scandalous gossip, they illustrate how closely sex, status, and social performance were intertwined in Roman consciousness. To be a prostitute was not only to labor, but also to participate in a broader culture of spectacle and indulgence, where personal and political lives intersected in strange and often exploitative ways. And then there was the humor, the small, sardonic observations that slipped past even the most serious moralists. Graffiti in Pompeii and Herculaneum, despite being crude, often contains jokes, insults, or playful references to sex. They remind us that Romans had a low, earthy sense of humor, even, or especially, when it involved prostitutes. Names of women, comments on clients, and sly sketches all survive as faint whispers of daily life, human voices beneath the centuries of stone and ash. One imagines the quiet satisfaction of a woman scratching a witty remark into the wall, knowing that future generations might glimpse a trace of her defiance, her wit, or her boredom. Life for a prostitute in Rome, then, was never simple. It required constant negotiation with law, with clients, with society, and with one's own body. It demanded intelligence, timing, and resilience. Some survived through cleverness or charm, others through brute endurance. Few ever enjoyed comfort or respectability, yet many created a personal world that allowed survival, humor, and even small victories. The contradictions of Rome, the laws versus the practice, public morality versus private indulgence, male privilege versus female labor, were never more visible than here, in the narrow streets, dimly lit rooms, and crowded taverns where women made their way through each day. As we slowly drift to the close of this part, I invite you to consider: how would you navigate a world with rules designed to marginalize you, yet a society dependent on your labor? Would cleverness, endurance, or subtle defiance be your strategy? Or would survival feel like a constant compromise? Think about it as you relax, and leave a quiet reflection in the comments. Sometimes imagining ourselves in another life tells us more about our own world than history alone. As we move further along the quiet streets of ancient Rome, it's important to pause and imagine the rhythms of daily life for a woman working in the city's sex trade. Unlike the polished halls of senators or the ornate villas of wealthy citizens, the spaces prostitutes inhabited were narrow, dimly lit, and entirely functional. Rooms were small, often little more than stone cubes, with a bench or low couch for the work itself, perhaps a small lamp, and the faint scent of oil or wax. It's tempting to imagine these spaces as purely grim, but even here, women made them livable in the smallest ways: scrawled graffiti, a prized hairpin, a piece of worn fabric that gave a touch of color to otherwise bare walls. Survival demanded attention not just to clients, but to the self, however fleetingly, in the moments between encounters. Morning, for many, began early. The city streets stirred with carts, vendors, and livestock, and somewhere in the Subura, women stirred themselves from slumber. Breakfast might be a simple bread and watered wine, consumed quickly before the flow of customers began. For some, the workday started slowly, with idleness punctuated by sudden bursts of demand. For others, it was a steady procession of coin exchanges and bodily labor. The hours could stretch endlessly, punctuated only by breaks to collect oneself, count coins, or whisper with colleagues about clients and rumors. Life required a certain monotony, a rhythm that could dull the mind even as it sharpened instincts. Clients themselves were a varied lot. Some were poor, scraping together coins from the morning market or a day's labor. Others were soldiers, officers, or even senators, seeking brief diversion from duty or the pressures of political life. The interactions were, in some cases, transactional and impersonal. Yet the transactional nature did not erase the subtle social dynamics. Many men preferred women who could entertain conversation, offer insight into the city's gossip, or demonstrate charm beyond the purely physical. In this way, intelligence and personality became commodities alongside beauty, each interaction a negotiation not just of coins, but of attention, patience, and skill. Evenings brought their own peculiarities. Lanterns flickered along the streets, illuminating the togas that marked registered prostitutes. Some women gathered near taverns or bathhouses, presenting themselves to passers-by. The city, as always, remained paradoxical, publicly moralistic, yet openly reliant on these very women. Men could criticize, poets could satirize, and magistrates could issue fines, yet the underlying demand persisted, woven invisibly into the daily commerce of Rome. A society that depended on pleasure while publicly condemning it is a society that lives in quiet contradictions, and nowhere was this more visible than in the sexual economy of the city. Within this world, rivalries and friendships formed with subtle care. Women watched each other for patterns, noting which clients were generous, which rooms were safer, and which colleagues might offer support or envy. These networks, often informal, created a fragile form of solidarity. A whispered warning about a difficult client, a shared loaf of bread, or a borrowed lamp could make the difference between a tolerable day and a disastrous one. Survival in Rome's brothels depended not just on skill, but on awareness, observation, and sometimes a quiet camaraderie forged under pressure. Health, of course, remained a constant concern. Disease could spread rapidly in spaces where bodies were closely entwined, and medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. Women took what precautions they could, relying on herbal remedies, oils, or other folk methods to soothe discomfort or prevent infection. There is a grim poetry in this, a recognition that even amid intimacy, one's body could betray, and that care was both practical and vital. The Roman city, full of crowds and commerce, created both opportunity and risk, and women had to navigate both carefully every day. Yet even amid the hardships, there were moments of levity, of the human spirit asserting itself. Graffiti provides glimpses into humor, complaint, and irony. One might see a joke about a clumsy client, a playful insult directed at a rival, or an affectionate note scribbled in the margins of a doorway. Such traces, though small, remind us that these women were not only surviving, they were observing, commenting, and occasionally rebelling in tiny ways. Life demanded endurance, but it also allowed for subtle forms of expression, little rebellions against the constraints of their world. Foreignness played a continuing role in the city's sexual economy. Women from Egypt, Syria, or Gaul brought not only distinct appearances, but cultural differences that could be leveraged. Their uniqueness made them desirable, and in some cases, more valuable to certain clients. Yet this foreignness also deepened vulnerability. A woman without local family or protection was more dependent on brothel owners, patrons, and networks for survival. Her labor was both a livelihood and a shield against instability, a delicate balance constantly negotiated. It's worth noting the financial dimension again, because money defined much of the reality. Small coins changed hands repeatedly. Copper, silver, and occasionally gold moved through pockets, into hands, and back into the economy. A brothel slave might see none of it, the coins going straight to her owner. An independent woman could earn enough to pay rent or feed herself, but wealth remained fragile, subject to patron whims, illness, or sudden change in fortune. Money was simultaneously empowerment and limitation, granting freedom within boundaries that were never entirely of one's own making. And what of the social perception of these women? Rome's moralists, poets, and satirists were never shy about labeling prostitutes as corrupt, lewd, or dangerous. Yet men of all classes continued to visit, and occasionally sought companionship beyond the transactional. In literature and anecdote alike, prostitutes were simultaneously mocked and admired, feared and desired. The duality of scorn and reliance created a peculiar existence. Women could never fully claim respect, yet their labor and presence were indispensable. The contradictions are exhausting to modern eyes, and perhaps even more so to those living them day after day. As we drift onward, we encounter another layer of complexity, the fleeting alliances with powerful men. Patrons, for all their wealth and status, could provide protection, gifts, or temporary comfort. Some women became mistresses in all but name, enjoying luxuries far beyond the reach of ordinary citizens. But such arrangements were precarious, always dependent on the whims of the patron, the caprice of favor, and the persistent possibility of losing everything. It's a world built on negotiation, subtlety, and constant awareness of shifting power. Survival, as ever, demanded intelligence, patience, and a careful eye. Even outside of clients, the city itself was both friend and threat. Crowds, commerce, magistrates, and law enforcement created a constant backdrop of movement, noise, and risk. A woman walking to her room might be jostled by a cart, insulted by a passerby, or observed by officials. Every day required calculation, every gesture carried potential consequences. Yet in these conditions, routines formed, habits developed, and rhythms emerged. Life continued, not heroically, but persistently, a testament to endurance amid adversity. And so, as Part 8 begins to settle into quiet, consider the peculiar balance of Rome's sexual economy. A city that criminalized, regulated, admired, exploited, and depended on the same women all at once. The contradictions were everywhere, as persistent as the traffic, the vendors, and the chatter of the streets. For a woman in that world, every day was negotiation, calculation, and subtle assertion of agency. Even amid hardship, humor and resilience persisted, faint as the graffiti scratched into stone walls, yet present. Before we drift to the next part, reflect for a moment. If you were walking those same streets, facing the same risks, how would you navigate them? Would you rely on wit, endurance, alliances, or some combination? Leave your thoughts quietly in the comments. It's a gentle exercise in empathy, imagining lives far removed from our own yet strangely recognizable in human concern and resilience. As we continue through the streets and alleys of Rome, it becomes clear that life for a prostitute was as much about negotiation and observation as it was about the act itself. Every day demanded a careful calibration of energy, appearance, and temperament. Unlike other forms of labor where rules were predictable, here the rules shifted constantly, responding to the whims of clients, the presence of officials, and the tacit demands of society. To survive, a woman had to learn, almost instinctively, the subtle rhythms of both human desire and human cruelty. For many, the most pressing concern was safety. Violence was always a possibility, whether from intoxicated clients, quarrelsome colleagues, or overbearing pimps. The city itself offered little protection. Laws might formally punish certain acts, but in practice, women were expected to manage these dangers themselves. Some developed techniques for self-defense, others relied on the proximity of fellow workers or the protection of a brothel owner. A glance, a gesture, even a carefully timed retreat could mean the difference between a minor incident and serious injury. The stakes were low for the state, but life and death for the women who moved through these streets daily. Time management, too, became an essential skill. The hours stretched long and irregular. Some women worked mornings, afternoons, and evenings in succession, while others were concentrated in specific shifts that corresponded to the habits of particular classes of men. A senator might prefer discreet afternoon visits. A laborer might arrive late in the evening, exhausted from toil but still seeking temporary pleasure. Anticipating patterns, remembering faces, and adjusting one's energy accordingly were subtle arts developed over time. In a sense, survival depended as much on psychological insight as on physical presence. And then there was the matter of clientele. Roman men were varied, from humble tradesmen to powerful aristocrats. Each brought a different challenge. Some were generous, tipping well, offering gifts, or providing small comforts that could ease the daily grind. Others were impatient, demanding, or coarse, creating hazards both physical and emotional. Women quickly learned to read behavior, gauge temperament, and deploy charm, flattery, or mild deflection when necessary. The interaction was transactional, yes, but never mechanical. Subtle social intelligence was currency alongside coins. Curiously, some women cultivated ongoing relationships with certain patrons. These arrangements were not quite romantic, not quite purely business, but a hybrid of both. A loyal patron might offer protection, gifts, or even temporary housing. Such relationships were precarious, of course. Favor could shift suddenly, leaving a woman exposed to financial or social instability. Yet the potential benefits were significant enough that many women nurtured these connections carefully. It was a delicate balancing act, constantly adjusting to the moods, desires, and whims of men whose lives were entirely different from their own. Among the more fascinating aspects of this world was the way women adapted their appearance. Hairstyles, wigs, jewelry, and even small cosmetic touches could be used to attract attention or signal availability. Some women relied on subtle scents or oils, others on color or posture. The presentation was as much about signaling status as it was about beauty. The elite courtesans, in particular, understood this intuitively, using style, gesture, and conversation as tools in the delicate negotiation of desire and survival. Appearance became a language, each detail conveying information, expectation, or invitation. Yet for all the calculated charm, exhaustion and monotony were ever present. The physical labor of the work was taxing, and the repetition of daily routines could dull spirits. Some women turned to small personal rituals to maintain a sense of control, tidying a room carefully, savoring a modest meal, or writing graffiti that expressed humor, complaint, or observation. These small acts of self-expression were a quiet rebellion against a system designed to reduce them to commodity alone. They remind us that human resilience often manifests in small, almost invisible ways. The presence of foreigners added another layer of complexity. Women brought from distant provinces were often treated as exotic, their difference leveraged for higher fees or social attention. Yet foreignness also increased vulnerability. Lacking local family, friends, or networks, these women were more dependent on the protection of patrons, brothel owners, or colleagues. Survival required careful navigation of cultural differences, language barriers, and social expectations. In this sense, every encounter was a negotiation not just of desire, but of identity, safety, and agency. Money remained central to every decision, as it always had. Coins were not just a reward, but a measure of security, a tool of negotiation, and a symbol of independence within narrow bounds. For the poorest, earnings were barely enough to cover food and lodging. For the more fortunate, careful planning could secure temporary comfort or small luxuries. Yet the fragility of these gains was a constant reminder that nothing was guaranteed. One illness, one fall from favor, and even the most calculated strategies could unravel. The city of Rome was generous in demand, yet cruel in provision. Social perception continued to complicate life. Prostitutes were simultaneously scorned, desired, and tolerated. Moralists and satirists ridiculed them in public discourse, while men of influence sought them in private. The contradictions were striking, yet they shaped the everyday reality of survival. Women had to internalize the scorn and navigate the desire, crafting strategies for endurance while maintaining the dignity, however limited, that allowed them to persist. Humor, subtlety, and intelligence became survival skills as much as charm or beauty. Brothel life also created subtle hierarchies. Experienced women might mentor newcomers, passing on knowledge of clients, safety practices, and negotiation techniques. Rivalries were inevitable, of course, but they were often tempered by the recognition that cooperation increased the chance of survival. A woman's success could depend as much on her colleagues as on her own abilities. Small acts of support, warnings about dangerous clients, or advice on presentation were critical in the complex social ecosystem of the brothel. Even the city's architecture contributed to this precarious existence. Narrow streets, high walls, and crowded alleys both sheltered and exposed women, creating opportunities and hazards in equal measure. They needed to know every corner, every shortcut, every shadow. A misstep could mean encountering hostile clients, angry officials, or a sudden shift in fortune. Familiarity with the physical landscape became as crucial as mastery of social negotiation. And then there was the persistent negotiation with time itself. Days were long, nights unpredictable. Clients arrived at odd hours. Exhaustion and vigilance competed for attention. Women adapted, sometimes resting in stolen moments, sometimes powering through with sheer discipline. Life was rhythm and repetition, punctuated by sudden spikes of activity. Endurance was both physical and psychological. Amid all this, small acts of levity persisted. Graffiti offered humor, venting, and reflection. Snippets of conversation revealed jokes, insults, and playful commentary. These tiny traces remind us that even in a system designed for exploitation, human ingenuity and humor persisted. One can almost picture a woman pausing to scratch a witty remark into a wall, smiling faintly at her own observation, leaving a trace of humanity that centuries later allows us to glimpse her mind. As we slowly approach the close of this part, Think about the remarkable resilience required to navigate such a world. Endurance, intelligence, subtlety, and humor, each was a tool, a shield, and a currency in its own right. The contradictions of Rome, the dependence on women's labor, the simultaneous scorn and desire, created a daily reality that demanded constant attention and adaptability. Before we drift toward the next section, consider this. How would you cultivate resilience if every aspect of society worked against you, yet depended on you at the same time? Leave a quiet thought in the comments. Sometimes imagining these choices gives us perspective on the resilience we take for granted today. As we continue to stroll through the quiet, winding streets of Rome, it's worth remembering that, despite all the legal, social, and physical pressures, women in prostitution often found subtle ways to exercise agency. Life was never comfortable, yet ingenuity allowed survival. Some women, for instance, cultivated specific skills that distinguished them from others: knowledge of poetry, conversational charm, the ability to mimic elite mannerisms. A client could be swayed not merely by appearance, but by the perception of sophistication. Such talents elevated a woman's status within the brothel and, occasionally, granted her a small measure of security and influence. This intersection of intelligence and labor is a reminder that prostitution in Rome was never a simple matter of bodies and coins. It involved constant observation, judgment, and adaptation. A skilled woman could read subtle cues in a client's voice or posture, anticipate moods, and modulate her behavior accordingly. Every visit became a negotiation not only of money but of attention, comfort, and safety. The social performance required in each encounter was mentally exhausting, yet it was one of the few tools available to assert control in a system that systematically stripped women of formal authority. Financial management also became an art. Coins, carefully counted and sometimes hidden, were vital not only for immediate needs, food, clothing, lodging, but for planning longer-term stability. Independent women might save small amounts to pay a year's rent in advance, or to secure passage for a friend or family member. Brothel workers often had to relinquish most of their earnings to owners or managers, but they found ways to hoard tiny savings or gifts from patrons. These careful calculations illustrate that survival required a combination of foresight, cunning, and endurance. The smallest advantage could mean a less miserable tomorrow. Social networks, too, were essential. Women shared knowledge, offered protection, and occasionally lent coins or goods to each other. Rivalries existed, certainly, but cooperation was often a matter of survival. The advice passed from experienced workers to newcomers could prevent injury, exploitation, or financial loss. In this sense, the brothel became not merely a workplace but a fragile ecosystem of mentorship, negotiation, and solidarity. Relationships, small and tentative as they might be, provided emotional ballast in an otherwise precarious existence. Interestingly, patrons themselves could serve as a form of informal protection. Loyal clients sometimes offered more than fleeting pleasure. Gifts, housing, or social connections were possible, provided one could navigate the relationship skillfully. These arrangements were delicate. Too much dependence risked exploitation, too little risked losing favor. The women who thrived were those who could balance intimacy with caution, favor with detachment, and necessity with opportunity. Every decision mattered, every encounter carried potential consequences. Foreign women continued to play a unique role in this ecosystem. Their novelty made them desirable in certain circles, yet it also made them vulnerable. Lacking local familial support, they relied heavily on patrons or colleagues for security. They had to learn quickly the cultural norms, language nuances, and social codes of Rome, while simultaneously leveraging the traits that made them marketable. In a sense, every client interaction became a negotiation of identity, presentation, and survival. A foreign accent or hairstyle was both advantage and hazard, charm and exposure, all in the same breath. Health remained a constant concern. In close quarters, the risk of infection or injury was high. Women developed rudimentary methods of care, herbal remedies, oils, and traditional treatments, but there was no real safety net. Even minor illnesses could interrupt income and force reliance on others. Endurance, again, became a currency as critical as coins or charm. The body was both a tool and a vulnerability, and the daily labor demanded careful attention to its limits. The daily routine, while exhausting, also offered glimpses of personal control. Some women established small rituals, tidying their rooms, arranging trinkets, or indulging in brief moments of pleasure or comfort. These small acts of self-determination were important, providing structure, a sense of normalcy, and fleeting reassurance. In a system that constrained nearly every aspect of life, such rituals were a quiet assertion of autonomy. Humor, too, persisted in subtle ways. Graffiti, often crude and fleeting, revealed jokes, observations, and moments of levity. Names scribbled alongside insults or playful commentary offer us a window into human resilience and the ability to find amusement even in constrained circumstances. One can imagine a woman pausing to write a clever remark on the wall, a small act of defiance and expression preserved in stone for centuries. These tiny traces remind us that, even in hardship, creativity and humor endure. Clients remained unpredictable, as always. Wealthy men could be generous, careless, or demanding. Soldiers, artisans, and laborers had their own patterns and temperaments. Navigating these variations required adaptability. Women learned to anticipate behavior, gauge risk, and modulate their responses. Each encounter was a lesson in psychology, negotiation, and endurance. The ability to read others became as essential as physical presence or appearance. Despite the challenges, some women found rare forms of stability. Courtesans, particularly those with connections or exceptional skill, could secure ongoing relationships that provided a degree of comfort and protection. Gifts, patronage, and social recognition occasionally allowed a life less harsh than that of street-level workers. Yet even in these cases, dependence remained, and fortunes could shift rapidly. Life in Rome's sexual economy was fragile, a constant negotiation between survival and aspiration. Even the architecture of the city itself influenced these dynamics. Narrow alleys, crowded streets, and multi-story buildings both concealed and exposed women, creating hazards and opportunities. Knowledge of the urban landscape was crucial for navigation and safety. A misstep, into an angry crowd, a jostling cart, or the attention of a hostile magistrate, could have serious consequences. The city was both stage and obstacle, shaping behavior and reinforcing the precariousness of daily life. Finally, one must consider the psychological toll. Exhaustion, monotony, and the constant calculation required to navigate clients, laws, and social scorn created a persistent undercurrent of stress. Yet within this environment, women cultivated resilience, ingenuity, and subtle forms of power. Humor, observation, and social networks provided buffers. Every small victory, every carefully saved coin, every moment of personal choice was a triumph against a system designed to minimize autonomy. As we close Part 10 and let these thoughts settle, consider this quietly. If you had been placed in a society that simultaneously depended on your labor and marginalized you entirely, how would you have navigated it? Would you have relied on wit, endurance, alliances, or small daily strategies to survive? Leave a gentle reflection in the comments. Sometimes imagining resilience in another life can illuminate our own. As we continue our gentle walk through ancient Rome, it becomes apparent that life for prostitutes was as much about subtle social navigation as it was about any physical labor. Beyond the streets, brothels, and taverns, these women existed in a complicated web of relationships, both with clients and with one another. The city was bustling, chaotic, and unforgiving, yet small personal victories, clever maneuvers, and quiet acts of ingenuity provided glimpses of autonomy and even occasional comfort. Some women learned to identify particular clients whose habits could be predicted, whose temperament allowed for safe interaction, and whose generosity went beyond mere coins. By observing carefully, remembering patterns, and occasionally anticipating desires, women could carve out a measure of security. This required patience, intelligence, and sometimes subtle manipulation. It was less about deception than about understanding human behavior and responding strategically, a skill as vital to survival as any physical attribute. Within the brothel, a delicate hierarchy existed. Experienced women often guided newcomers, sharing knowledge about particular clients, warning of potential dangers, or teaching techniques of persuasion and negotiation. Rivalries existed, of course, but cooperation often ensured mutual benefit. Survival in Rome's bustling neighborhoods required social intelligence. A woman could gain protection, advice, and even companionship from carefully cultivated alliances. The brothel was, in a sense, a microcosm of the larger society, a place where subtle skill, observation, and wit determined outcomes more than brute force ever could. Foreign women, brought in from distant provinces, added another layer of complexity. Their exoticness could be advantageous, drawing attention and higher fees from curious or status-conscious clients. Yet being foreign also made them vulnerable. They lacked local support networks, faced language barriers, and were often at the mercy of both clients and owners. Every interaction became a negotiation not only of desire but also of identity and survival. A distinctive accent or hairstyle could be an asset or a liability, a subtle marker that demanded careful management. Financial acumen was equally crucial. Coins were not merely compensation. They were a form of security, a tool for planning, and a measure of autonomy. Many women meticulously saved small portions of their earnings, hiding them from owners or colleagues to maintain a degree of independence. Others invested in tiny luxuries or necessities, such as food, clothing, or toiletries, carefully stretching resources to last through periods of uncertainty. This constant balancing act was both mundane and vital, a quiet demonstration of resourcefulness and foresight. Health remained a persistent concern. Illness could quickly disrupt income, forcing dependence on others or depleting carefully saved funds. Women employed whatever remedies were available, herbs, oils, and traditional treatments, to maintain their bodies in working order. Physical resilience was inseparable from social and economic resilience. Fatigue, repetitive labor, and occasional violence compounded the challenges, yet women found ways to endure, employing both practical measures and subtle psychological strategies to maintain equilibrium. Daily routines, though exhausting, offered small moments of control. Rooms might be tidied, trinkets arranged, or personal grooming performed with care. These small rituals provided comfort and continuity in a life otherwise dictated by external demands. Even graffiti offered a form of expression, humor, or commentary. A witty inscription, a playful drawing, or a sardonic remark could provide fleeting relief and a sense of agency. These small acts, though ephemeral, reveal the human capacity to assert selfhood even in constrained circumstances. Clients varied widely, and each brought unique challenges. Some were generous, offering gifts or protection. Others were impatient, demanding, or unpredictable, requiring negotiation and careful attention. The ability to read behavior, anticipate moods, and respond appropriately was critical. Every encounter required more than physical labor. It demanded emotional intelligence, subtlety, and patience. These skills, honed over time, were as vital as appearance or stamina. Interestingly, some women cultivated ongoing relationships with patrons that provided rare security. These arrangements were delicate and often precarious, dependent on the patron's continued favor. Gifts, temporary housing, and social connections could ease daily pressures, yet reliance carried risks. Favor could shift suddenly, leaving even the most cautious woman exposed. In such a world, success depended on the careful management of both personal and professional relationships, balancing intimacy with distance and opportunity with caution. Humor and observation remained essential tools. Even in the most constrained environments, women found ways to express themselves. Graffiti, jokes whispered to colleagues, and small playful gestures offered psychological relief. These acts allowed for resilience, serving as a buffer against the monotony, labor, and scorn that surrounded daily life. Humor became a survival strategy, a way to assert personality and presence in a society determined to marginalize them. Social perception remained a persistent tension. Moralists condemned, poets satirized, and the public judged, while men privately sought out these same women. The contradictions created a life in which women were simultaneously scorned and indispensable. They learned to navigate these dynamics with subtlety, deploying charm, wit, and strategy to maintain both safety and opportunity. Life required constant observation, adjustment, and ingenuity. Even the city's physical environment shaped experiences. Narrow alleys, bustling markets, and high walls created both shelter and exposure. Knowledge of the city was crucial. Shortcuts, shadows, and familiar faces could provide safety or opportunity, while missteps could result in danger or loss. The urban landscape was an ever-present partner in survival, demanding awareness and adaptability in equal measure. Endurance, both physical and mental, was paramount. Long days, irregular hours, and the constant negotiation of power and desire tested stamina. Yet within this endurance existed moments of quiet victory, successfully navigating a difficult client, securing a patron's favor, or simply surviving another day. Small achievements, though easily overlooked, were significant markers of resilience. Before we drift toward next, consider the quiet skill and persistence required to navigate such a world. Strategy, observation, wit, humor, and endurance were as vital as any coin earned. Life in Rome's sexual economy was complex, demanding, and precarious, yet it was also a space where small acts of autonomy, intelligence, and subtle influence could create meaning and stability, however fleeting. As this part settles, I invite you to reflect gently. If you were living in a society that simultaneously depended on you and marginalized you entirely, what strategies of resilience and survival might you adopt? Leave a soft thought in the comments, imagining the resourcefulness and ingenuity needed to endure in such a world. As we drift toward the end of our journey through ancient Rome, it's worth taking a deep, quiet breath and letting the streets, the brothels, and the narrow alleys settle in your mind like a gentle memory. Life for prostitutes in Rome was far from simple, yet within the complexity, danger, and marginalization, women found ways to endure, to assert subtle control, and even to claim fleeting comfort. Their daily existence was a balancing act, an intricate negotiation of safety, favor, income, and identity, carried out with intelligence, humor, and resilience. We've wandered through rooms small and dimly lit, observed clients of all sorts, generous and impatient, refined and coarse, and followed the careful rhythms of labor that shaped every day. We've considered the importance of alliances, friendships, and mentorship within brothels, the unique position of foreign women navigating unfamiliar terrain, and the ways appearance, charm, and wit were currency as tangible as coins. All of these threads wove together into a life that demanded constant awareness and adaptability, a delicate dance of survival amid societal contradiction. Even the mundane details matter. Coins counted and hidden, rooms tidied with care, small rituals performed in the rare moments of privacy. They speak to human ingenuity and the quiet assertion of selfhood. Humor, expressed through graffiti, playful remarks, or private jokes, offered relief and perspective, reminding us that even in constraint, personality persists. In every act, whether practical or subtle, women carved out a sliver of agency in a world intent on limiting it. One can almost hear the faint echoes of conversation, the rustle of skirts along cobbled streets, the distant clatter of carts and footsteps, and imagine women pausing to observe, assess, and survive in a city that alternately scorned and depended on them. Survival required skill, endurance, cleverness, and, often, a sense of humor that could turn a minor indignity into a moment of private triumph. These quiet victories, though unnoticed by history's grand narratives, were meaningful in their own right. Patrons, whether fleeting or recurring, brought both opportunity and hazard. A loyal client might provide gifts, temporary security, or subtle protection, while an impatient or hostile one could introduce danger. Balancing intimacy, independence, and personal safety was a daily practice. And yet, even amidst this precarious dance, women exercised creativity, intelligence, and resilience. They read people, anticipated behavior, and carefully calibrated their actions to preserve both income and body. It was a life of constant strategy, a subtle and persistent negotiation that required as much wit as any formal education could provide. The contradictions of Roman society remained ever present. Public moral condemnation paired with private reliance, legal restrictions juxtaposed with social necessity. Women in prostitution existed in the gray space between scorn and essential service. Their labor, dismissed and exploited, was vital to the rhythms of the city. Their intelligence, humor, and subtle social navigation allowed them to carve spaces of autonomy, small though they might have been. The delicate balance of oppression and opportunity defined the daily experience, and the resilience required to endure it is a quiet marvel of human adaptability. As we allow this reflection to settle, it is worth acknowledging the personal lives that intersected with this work. Moments of friendship, rivalry, humor, or clever strategy were woven seamlessly into survival. Small victories, earning extra coins, securing a loyal patron, or crafting a witty remark on a wall, offered psychological relief and practical advantage. Endurance, observation, and subtle manipulation were tools as critical as any physical skill, demonstrating the remarkable ingenuity required to navigate such a world. And so, as our journey through these streets and lives comes to a gentle pause, consider the endurance, skill, and subtle agency these women exercised. Their lives, often dismissed or vilified by contemporary observers, reveal a remarkable persistence in the face of danger, societal scorn, and economic precarity. In imagining their daily experiences, one is reminded of the quiet complexity of human resilience, the ways we adapt, and the small acts of self-determination that sustain us even in difficult circumstances. Before we slowly drift into rest, I invite you to reflect quietly. What small acts of agency, humor, or observation might help us endure our own daily struggles, however different from those of ancient Rome? Leave a soft thought in the comments, imagining resilience in contexts far removed from your own. Sometimes history's quietest stories illuminate the persistence of the human spirit in ways we forget to notice in our own lives. And now, as we close this gentle exploration, thank you for accompanying me through the streets, rooms, and daily lives of these women. If you found this journey relaxing or illuminating, consider softly pressing like, sharing with someone who enjoys history in a calm voice, or subscribing for more sleepy stories from the past. Every click is a quiet encouragement to continue these slow wanderings through time. Let's linger a little longer in thought, letting the streets of Rome fade softly behind our eyes, the faint laughter, whispers, and resilience of these women lingering as we drift toward rest. Thank you for being here. Sleep well, and let the faint hum of history carry you gently through the night.